What's the unit called? Thimble of liquid, small amount. What's the unit called? Keg of beer. What's the unit called? Tumbler of whiskey. What's the unit called? Tank of fuel. What's the unit called? Vial of medicine. What's the unit called? Packet of sugar. What's the unit called? A bowl of soup. What's the unit called? Sip of tea. What's the unit called? Splash of milk. What's the unit called? Dash of salt. What's the unit called? A pitcher of lemonade. What's the unit called? Ladle of soup. What's the unit called? Phial of potion in fantasy contexts. What's the unit called? Shot glass of vodka. What's the unit called? Sachet of sauce. What's the unit called? Drizzle of olive oil. What's the unit called? Carton of milk. What's the unit called? Ampoule of medicine. What's the unit called? Spray of perfume. What's the unit called? Ampoule of medicine. What's the unit called? A jug of juice. What's the unit called? Tablespoon of syrup. What's the unit called? Decanter of wine. What's the unit called? Pouch of juice. What's the unit called? Scoop of ice cream. What's the unit called? A cup of coffee. What's the unit called? Flagon of wine. What's the unit called? A bottle of water. What's the unit called? Bucket of water. What's the unit called? Barrel of oil. What's the unit called? Jar of honey. What's the unit called? A flask of alcohol. What's the unit called? Cask of wine. What's the unit called? Spoonful of sugar. What's the unit called? Shot of whiskey. What's the unit called? Teaspoon of honey. What's the unit called? A pint of beer. What's the unit called? Gallon of water. What's the unit called? A can of soda. What's the unit called? A mug of tea. What's the unit called? A drop of water. What's the unit called? A glass of water. What's the unit called? A bottle of water. What's the unit called? A tube of toothpaste. What's the unit called? A sip of tea. What's the unit called? A gallon of water.